The receptionist felt sorry for the beggar and allowed her to sing in the luxury hotel. When the owner arrived, the lobby of the Imperial Hotel gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers hanging imposingly from the vaulted ceiling. The polished marble floor reflected the shiny leather shoes of passing guests, leaving a trail of expensive perfumes and carefree conversations. Seated behind the reception desk, Gustavo observed each detail with the familiarity of someone living in a world that didn't belong to him. The constant flow of fur coats, sparkling dresses, and expensive tuxedos was usual. But tonight, the excitement was even greater. The annual gala promised to be the most extravagant of the year, with the upper echelon of society gathered to flaunt their power and wealth. Gustavo, however, felt increasingly out of place. His fingers played with the pen he held, while his eyes wandered around the hall decorated with exotic flowers and luxurious art pieces. Guests arrived one after another, displaying rehearsed smiles and laughs that sounded hollow in his ears. All this wealth and so little heart, he thought, forcing a smile for a couple who had just approached the counter to ask about the location of the party. "Good evening, sir and madam. The party is in the Crystal Hall on the second floor. The elevator is to your left," he informed them with automatic courtesy, while his thoughts quickly returned to that sense of emptiness that seemed to accompany his job for years. This scene repeated day after day. Men and women who lived lives of luxury, driven by ambitions and desires he couldn't understand. For Gustavo, all of it seemed superficial, as if the shine of money concealed an internal darkness. The hotel, despite being his workplace, had become a symbol of what he most despised. The coldness of the walls decorated with luxury was not very different from the world he observed daily. A world where people's worth seemed to be measured by what they wore, by what they could buy, not by what they carried in their hearts. And increasingly this bothered him. He had lost his mother very early, and maybe that was what fueled the emptiness inside him. She had been a singer, a voice that filled the small apartment where they lived with a mix of hope and melancholy. On good days, she sang joyful songs that made Gustavo forget for a few moments that money was short and the future uncertain. On bad days, the songs were full of pain, as if each note were a piece of her broken soul. Her loss had been a hard blow, a breaking point he never completely overcame. Now, he was a man trapped in his own sadness, living in a world that seemed the opposite of what his mother represented. For her, music was the purest expression of the soul, a connection between people. But there, in that hotel, he only saw disconnection. A loud laugh echoed through the lobby, bringing Gustavo back to reality. He looked at the clock on the wall, watching the hours pass, as his eyes once again got lost in the constant comings and goings of the guests. Somehow, he always felt like a silent spectator, someone watching life happen without ever really participating in it. Across the hall, the hotel manager supervised the final preparations with meticulous glances. Nothing could be out of place. The head chef rushed back and forth. Waiters adjusted crystal glasses on tables with almost surgical precision. Everything had to be perfect, but Gustavo knew that, despite all the apparent perfection, something was deeply wrong, and that something was the soul missing from that world of excesses. He got up from his chair for a moment and went to the window, looking outside. Out there on the sidewalk was a completely different reality. Among the luxury cars arriving, he could see the shadows of a city that no one inside seemed to notice. Ordinary people, ordinary lives, far from the glitters and gold. And, for a second, he felt as if that glass barrier between the hotel and the street was much more symbolic than physical. Sighing, he returned to his place behind the counter. It was just another night, and as always, he would be the silent spectator of an empty spectacle. But that night, something bothered him more than usual. Maybe it was the nostalgia for the songs his mother used to sing. Maybe it was the growing feeling that he was somehow trapped in a life that made no sense. Either way, he felt a deep restlessness, as if something were about to happen. Something that would change the course of that soulless routine. With that thought in mind, he straightened his jacket and waited in silence for the inevitable to occur. Outside the Imperial Hotel, the night felt colder than usual, though it was only autumn. The icy breeze swept through the illuminated streets, where luxury cars parked and richly dressed guests descended with airs of royalty. The golden lights from shop windows and wrought iron lampposts cast long, distorted shadows on the ground, where life seemed to divide into two worlds. The world of those entering with rehearsed smiles, and the world of those watching in silence, like invisible ghosts on the margins of the grand party. Maria was among the invisible ones. The woman, with disheveled gray hair and skin marked by the harshness of time, watched the guests pass by. Her presence was discreet, almost imperceptible, dressed in layers of worn and dirty clothes that barely protected her from the cold. Her eyes, once vibrant, now reflected the fatigue of a life of struggle. Each line on her face told a story, and her hunched posture suggested not only the weight of age, but the burden of carrying much more than just years. She watched the grand entrance of the hotel, with its sparkling revolving doors and the constant flow of people who seemed to live in a universe so distant from her own. She was a street singer, or at least she used to be. Her voice, which had once enchanted street corners in so many places, now faded as her health declined. No one stopped to listen to Maria anymore. On good days, when her throat allowed her to sing, the notes came out ragged, filled with a sadness passers-by preferred to ignore. And even when she tried to smile to attract curious glances, she received only looks of disdain or, worse, no attention at all. The indifference weighed more than the coins that rarely fell into her old hat. That night, Maria had no intention of singing. There was something about the party that attracted her strangely, a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. Maybe it was the distant music escaping through closed windows. Or maybe it was the memory of better times, when she herself had been someone who sang for the delight of others. However, unlike the others, she didn't belong to that place. She knew it, and there was no denying it. But still, her feet had brought her there, in the hope of what? She wasn't even sure. Perhaps just the desire to feel, for an instant, that she was still part of the world. Maria took a hesitant step toward the entrance, her eyes fixed on the revolving doors, where the movement seemed like a choreography of wealth and glamour. Her gaze was interrupted when a security guard, dressed in an impeccable suit, raised his hand, blocking her path with a dry, impersonal gesture. "Hey you, where do you think you're going?" His voice was rude, cutting. Maria stepped back immediately, like a wounded animal. Her posture shrank further, and she muttered something inaudible with no real intention of protesting. She knew she would be turned away, as always, but at that moment, the rejection seemed even more bitter. The security guard stepped forward, impatient, with no hint of compassion in his eyes. He nudged her slightly aside, as if merely moving an inconvenient object out of the way. "You can't stay here. Get out!" She stumbled backward, dignity slipping like dirty rain over her shoulders. For a moment, her eyes met her own reflection in the entrance glass. The image of an aged woman, a shadow that seemed so out of place in that scene of opulence. It was as if she were a smudge on the impeccable canvas of that night. The impact of the rejection wasn't physical, but its effect on her soul made her tremble slightly. Across the door, Gustavo watched everything. From the reception desk, he had a clear view of what was happening outside. While the guests entered noisily, exchanging greetings and smiles, his eyes fixed on that woman. There was something about her that immediately captured his attention. Something beyond her worn clothes and weary expression. A familiar feeling, a distant echo of another life, another voice. His chest tightened almost involuntarily. He watched her trying to approach the entrance, only to be pushed away, as if she were less than nothing. For a moment, he saw his own mother in that woman. The way she held her bag against her body, as if that gesture could protect her from the world's coldness, was the same stance his mother adopted on her toughest days. When his mother's health began to fail, she too had been treated with disdain by those who didn't understand the value of her art. Gustavo remembered afternoons when she returned home with empty eyes, after singing for audiences who didn't care, after being ignored and silenced by those who didn't know how to listen. A familiar pain struck him, and Gustavo knew, at that moment, that he couldn't simply continue ignoring the woman outside. He could feel the same indifference that had consumed his mother also consuming Maria, and it deeply disturbed him. He gripped the pen in his hand more tightly as he internally struggled with the idea of intervening. The hotel had its rules, and he knew he shouldn't get involved. Not with an unwanted guest. Not with someone the hotel system would ignore without a second thought. But how could he turn a blind eye? Every fiber of his being told him that this woman wasn't just any stranger, that there was something deeper there, something he needed to understand. Gustavo felt an inexplicable connection, almost as if fate had placed Maria in his path for some reason he didn't yet comprehend. Finally, he made a decision. He looked away from the scene and turned, walking toward the hall manager, trying to keep his composure. He knew he needed to be careful. His hands trembled slightly as he returned to the counter, his heart beating faster. Outside, Maria was still standing, ignored, invisible. But to Gustavo, she was anything but invisible. And he knew this would change the course of the night. Gustavo could no longer ignore what he was seeing. Something inside him was simmering, a mix of indignation and an almost desperate urge to do something different, something right. The world might be cruel and cold, but at that moment, he refused to be part of that cruelty. With his heart racing, he set down the pen he was holding, looked around to make sure the manager was busy, and walked to the glass door. As he crossed the hotel doors, the cold breeze hit him, and he approached Maria, who was still trying to regain her emotional balance after the security guard's shove. She kept her eyes down, her body curved as if she wanted to disappear into the crowd, becoming invisible again. But Gustavo wouldn't let that happen. "Ma'am," he called softly, trying not to startle her. Maria slowly lifted her eyes, surprised to see someone from the hotel speaking to her. For an instant, she seemed to hesitate, perhaps expecting him to also push her back into the darkness of the night. But Gustavo's gaze was different. There was no arrogance in his eyes, none of the coldness she had grown accustomed to seeing. There was something human there, something that made Maria relax her shoulders for a moment. "Come," he repeated with a firm yet gentle voice, offering his hand as if he wanted to guide her out of the cold. "Rest a little? The world is too cruel for someone with a gift like yours." Maria blinked, confused. What did he mean by that? How did he know she had any kind of gift? She glanced at the bright hotel behind him, then back at Gustavo, studying his face for a few more seconds. He was a young man with serious features, but his eyes betrayed an old sadness, something that made her feel an inexplicable connection. I can't go in there," she murmured, her voice hoarse, scraped by years of singing on the streets and the hard life she led. "I don't belong there." The almost mechanical gesture of clutching her coat against her chest showed that she knew exactly where her place in the world was, and that place wasn't inside a luxury hotel. But Gustavo wasn't deterred by her initial resistance. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, now in an attempt to break through the clear barrier of shame surrounding her. "It doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is what you carry. Come, just for a few minutes." The cold on Maria's hands made her tremble slightly. She looked once more at the hotel entrance, then at the ground, as if searching for an excuse to say no. But the pain in her legs, the accumulated exhaustion, and Gustavo's unexpectedly welcoming tone made her reconsider. Against her instinct to refuse any kind of help, she nodded slightly, accepting the offer. Gustavo gave a half-smile, relieved. He opened the door so she could enter first. As they walked through the lobby, he felt the curious glances of a few guests who wondered what that woman, in worn clothes and hesitant steps, was doing there. The security guards, noticing that Gustavo was accompanying her, preferred not to interfere, but he knew he had broken every rule of the hotel. If the manager, or worse, the hotel owner found out, the consequences wouldn't be small. Yet, he didn't care. It was as if something greater was at stake. He guided Maria to a discreet corner of the lobby, away from critical eyes, where a soft couch seemed like a small promise of relief for her tired body. As she sat down, Gustavo crouched to speak more closely. "You were once a singer, weren't you?" he asked, direct yet gentle, almost as if he already knew the answer. Maria lowered her eyes, a shadow of sadness passing over her face like a distant, painful memory. She nodded slowly. "A long time ago, a very long time," she murmured, her voice heavy with an old lament. She said nothing more, but the distant look in her eyes revealed the years of battles, losses, and failures etched into every wrinkle on her face. "My mother sang too," Gustavo revealed, not knowing exactly why he was sharing this with a stranger. "She never found fame, but her voice, she sang with soul. And seeing you out there, I felt like I was seeing her again." Maria looked up, surprised by his confession. There was something in the way Gustavo spoke that made her feel an immediate connection. He wasn't offering pity, but rather understanding, a silent empathy from someone who had also lost something important. They were silent for a moment, the distant sound of the gala echoing on the other side of the hall. Gustavo then took a deep breath, feeling a surge of courage or perhaps madness taking over him. "How would you feel about singing here tonight for them?" he asked, breaking the silence with a proposal that seemed absurd, even to himself. Maria blinked, confused, her mouth slightly open. "Sing here?" She looked around, as if checking if he was really serious. The luxurious lobby, with its sparkling chandeliers and impeccable decor, was the complete opposite of the streets where her voice echoed unanswered. "No, I can't. I'm not that person anymore," she said, shaking her head with a sad, almost incredulous smile. Gustavo leaned forward, determined. "They don't know who you are, or who you were, but I do, and I think they need to hear you." Maria hesitated, her face marked by doubt. It was a risky proposal. Singing for that kind of audience was something she hadn't done in years, and the idea of exposing herself, of putting herself back under the cold and judgmental gazes of strangers, scared her. But something in the intensity of Gustavo's look and the words he used made her reconsider. She looked at her hands, wrinkled and worn, as if measuring the weight of the decision. Then, slowly, as if drawing courage from a deep well within herself, she whispered, "I can try." Gustavo smiled. "That's all I ask." He knew something greater was happening, something that transcended simply challenging the hotel's rules. This woman, invisible to everyone else, was about to become the center of a night that, until then, had only false shine. Now, something true could happen. He helped Maria to her feet, and together they walked through the lobby toward the ballroom, where the unexpected awaited. The main hall of the Imperial Hotel was in full swing. The Crystal Ballroom, with its walls adorned with mirrors and crystal chandeliers, was a spectacle in itself. Finely set tables, glasses clinking with expensive wine, guests exchanging laughter and calculated whispers, all composed the setting of a perfect gala party. The background music, soft and discreet, merely accentuated the luxury overflowing in every detail. Gustavo led Maria to a corner of the ballroom where a small, makeshift stage had been set up for the pianist who had, until then, entertained the guests with light and inoffensive notes, a sound almost decorative. The voices of conversation and the clinking of glasses drowned out the background music, rendering it distant, irrelevant. No one paid much attention, for the rich and powerful filling the room. The music was just a backdrop for their displays of power and status. As Maria climbed onto the small stage, Gustavo felt his heart racing. He knew this was a risky move. He looked at the guests and noticed how many were completely oblivious to Maria's presence. Her simple, worn clothes didn't fit the place. The sparkling jewelry on the women's necks, the impeccable ties of the men, everything there seemed to shine in a way that cruelly contrasted with the awkward, aged figure now preparing to sing. The pianist, confused, looked to Gustavo for an explanation, but he merely gestured for him to continue playing. Maria, with a slow, almost reverent pace, adjusted the microphone to her height. She seemed nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she held the stand, but her eyes, though hesitant, carried a quiet flame. "Is she going to sing?" A blonde woman in a shimmering dress whispered to the man beside her, casting a disdainful look at Maria. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Other guests began to notice the movement. Some raised their eyebrows in perplexity, while others continued their conversations, indifferent to what was about to happen. Gustavo held his breath. He didn't know what to expect, but something inside him told him this was the right thing to do. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the doubts echoing in her mind. She knew this audience wasn't like those on the streets, where coins were tossed with indifference. This place was different, but deep down, Maria also knew that her singing wasn't just for them. It never had been. She sang because music was the only thread that connected her to the past, to what she had lost. Singing was, in a way, remembering who she had been before time and tragedy erased everything. When she opened her eyes again, her expression changed. The piano began with soft notes, and slowly, almost as if testing her own voice, Maria started to sing. At first, her voice was low, a fragile whisper that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the room. Some guests laughed, thinking it would be a fleeting eccentricity. But then something surprising happened. Her voice, laden with emotion and memory, began to swell. The melancholy and gentle tone enveloped the hall in a way that was almost invisible but inevitable. The words leaving her mouth carried a pain only those who had lost something important could understand. The conversations gradually faded. The snobbish, scornful laughter disappeared as people began to realize what was happening. Maria's voice held a depth none of them expected, a tragic beauty that captured the attention of anyone listening. It was as if the entire hall, with all its shine, was suddenly filled with something that transcended material luxury. Something real. One of the younger women, dressed in a long blue silk gown, paused, mid-conversation, staring at Maria almost hypnotically. "Who is she?" she murmured to herself, not expecting an answer. Gustavo watched everything from the corner of the room, his heart still racing, but now in a different way. He saw the changing expressions on people's faces. Not all of them, of course, some still cast disdainful looks, as if Maria's presence were an affront to the atmosphere of exclusivity. A middle-aged man, his face flushed from too much wine, let out a low laugh and commented to his friends nearby, "What a pathetic spectacle. Who let her in here?" But those comments didn't matter. What mattered was the subtle change Gustavo saw in the faces of others. Gradually, the mask fell. Eyes began to shine with a mixture of surprise and contained emotion. Something within the hearts of people, something they had long forgotten, was being touched. Maria continued to sing, her voice no longer trembling. It was steady, filled with raw, sincere melancholy. The song's lyrics spoke of losses, broken loves, a past that couldn't be reclaimed yet remained alive within her. It was a song without embellishments, without the grandeur expected at such a party, but precisely because of this, it was captivating. When she finished the song, the final piano chord faded into the air, and silence took over the room. A deep, almost uncomfortable silence, as if no one knew exactly what to do or say. The once noisy, superficial party now seemed void of words. Everyone looked at Maria, some with admiration, others with incomprehension, but none could deny the impact her voice had made. Gustavo felt the weight of that transformation. He knew that at that instant, something had changed not only in the room, but within himself. What had started as an impulsive act of compassion had turned into something greater, something he didn't yet fully understand, but knew was important. Maria, in turn, simply lowered the microphone and took a step back, breathing deeply. Her face, illuminated by the soft stage light, still carried that expression of sadness. But now there was something more. A kind of quiet peace, as if for a few minutes she had returned to who she once was. Meanwhile, across the hall, the main door opened with unexpected force. The hotel owner, Federico, entered with firm steps, his face rigid, and his eyes scanned the room with his usual severity. Gustavo felt his stomach twist. What would he do when he saw Maria on stage? The hotel owner, known for his intolerance toward anything that didn't fit the standards of luxury and perfection, would hardly be pleased with a beggar's presence among his guests. Federico stopped in the middle of the hall, his eyes fixed on Maria's figure still standing on the stage. The silence in the room seemed even heavier with his arrival, and Gustavo held his breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The silence in the ballroom was almost oppressive as Federico entered. His stance was imposing. His presence commanded the space in a way that required no words. The guests, who had been mesmerized by Maria's performance, quickly changed their expressions. Some adjusted their clothes instinctively, while others lowered their eyes, fearing to draw the unwanted attention of a man known for his strictness and unwavering focus on business. Federico walked with steady steps, jaw clenched and gaze cold. A man in his early 50s, his carefully combed gray hair and tailored suit exuded control and power. He was the kind of person who saw the hotel not just as an establishment, but as a reflection of himself, a temple of luxury, perfection, and exclusivity. Anything that compromised that image was a personal affront. His eyes swept over the room with a mix of disdain and scrutiny, as if ensuring everything met his exacting standards. However, something in the air made him pause for a moment. There was an oddness, a stillness that shouldn't exist at an event of that scale. His critical gaze soon settled on the small, improvised stage in the corner of the hall, where Maria still stood, her shoulders slumped and breathing slightly labored after her performance. Gustavo, observing everything from a corner, felt a chill run up his spine as he saw Federico freeze in the middle of the hall. The owner's gaze was fixed on Maria, and Gustavo knew exactly what he was thinking. If he finds out she's a beggar, I'm done, he thought, feeling his heart race in his chest. He had risked everything by bringing Maria inside, and now he stood before the hotel's most powerful figure, the man who held the fate of everyone working there in his hands. Federico, without taking his eyes off Maria, took a few steps forward, ignoring the nervous murmurs of the guests around him. His expression was a mix of perplexity and irritation, as if the very fact that this woman was there insulted the sophisticated atmosphere he so prized. It was evident she didn't belong in that place. Her worn clothes, her scuffed shoes, the way she moved, everything about her screamed poverty, a brutal contrast to the luxury and opulence dominating the hall. He stopped a few meters from the stage, eyebrows raised, observing Maria with a predatory gaze. The hall, once lively and gleaming, now seemed suspended in a state of silent expectation. The guests, sensing the tension in the air, remained quiet, watching the unfolding scene with curious and, for some, anxious eyes. Finally, Federico spoke, his voice cold as it sliced through the air like a blade. "What's happening here?" His question was directed at no one in particular, but the tone was clear. He wanted an explanation, and fast. Gustavo, who had tried to stay invisible until that moment, felt the weight of Federico's gaze fall upon him. There was no escaping it. Swallowing hard, Gustavo took a step forward, nerves on edge. "Mr. Federico, I invited this lady to sing." Federico narrowed his eyes, irritation visibly rising on his face. "You invited her?" he repeated, the incredulity in his voice quickly giving way to contained fury. "Who is this woman, Gustavo? And why is she singing in my hotel without my permission?" The guests, now in complete silence, watched the unfolding scene with growing interest. Some, especially the more arrogant ones, began to whisper among themselves, exchanging acidic comments. "She looks like a beggar," muttered a corpulent man with a stifled laugh. "Who let something like this happen in a place like this?" Gustavo felt the blood pounding in his temples. He knew he had to respond quickly, but how could he explain something so out of the ordinary to someone like Federico? He took a deep breath, trying to control the panic that threatened to consume him entirely. She has talent, sir. I heard her singing outside, and I thought she deserved a chance. Her voice, it's special," Gustavo said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tension was evident. "Talent?" Federico repeated, his features hardening even more. "You're telling me that in one of the city's most prestigious hotels, on a gala night with the most influential guests, you thought it was appropriate to bring in a street woman to sing?" Gustavo opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Federico raised a hand, cutting him off. He turned to Maria, his gaze now fierce. "Who are you?" His voice was low, but the tone made it clear he wasn't in the mood for games. Maria, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, slowly lifted her head. Federico's gaze was hard, relentless, but there was something in Maria's eyes that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind Federico was used to seeing in people when he addressed them with his authoritative voice. Maria's gaze was deeper, as if it held an ancient and immense pain, so vast that Federico's mere presence didn't intimidate her. "I'm a singer," Maria replied, her voice soft but firm. "Or at least I used to be." Federico laughed, a bitter laugh devoid of humor. "A singer? And where did you sing, exactly? On street corners? In subways? Or maybe in some other place no one here cares about?" The ballroom was in complete silence. Some guests, clearly uncomfortable with Federico's cruel tone, exchanged glances, but no one dared to intervene. Gustavo felt the tension rising around him, and his instinct told him to interrupt, to try to argue, but he knew that any additional words could worsen the situation. Maria, however, didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on Federico and, instead of retreating, took a small step forward. "Yes," she said, her voice now stronger. "I sang in the streets, but I also sang for audiences who truly listened. I sang for people who needed to feel something money can't buy." Federico, momentarily taken aback by her unexpected response, hesitated. But soon his expression hardened again. "Here, madam, only one thing matters. And it's not talent. It's not art. Here, only money has value. And you don't belong in this place." These cold, definitive words echoed through the hall like a verdict. Federico's gaze was merciless. He was about to give the order for Maria to be removed when something in the air shifted. Maria, with a serene dignity, held her ground, and her voice, once again, soft yet powerful, broke the silence with a simple statement. "You're wrong." The hall froze, and every gaze turned to Maria. Even Federico seemed momentarily confused. Maria continued, her voice carrying a quiet sadness. "There are things in this world that money can never buy. And music is one of them." The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Federico stared at her, his eyes blazing with anger, but something in those words, and in the way they were spoken, touched a part of everyone present. A part that, no matter how shielded by luxury, was still human. The silence in the hall felt even heavier after Maria's final words. Her declaration that music is something money can never buy echoed off the walls of the luxurious Imperial Hotel like a direct affront to the power Federico embodied. He, a man who had built his empire on the belief that everything and everyone could be bought, looked at Maria as if she were an anomaly, an error in the controlled and perfect scene he so carefully orchestrated. Federico slowly turned, his eyes blazing with anger as he focused on Gustavo. The receptionist felt the weight of that gaze like a death sentence. He knew he was in dangerous territory, but something within him refused to back down. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. What was at stake now was greater than his job. It was about dignity, compassion, and in some way, the memory of his mother, whose songs and soul seemed to live in Maria's voice. Federico took 2 firm steps toward Gustavo, his face hardened. "How dare you?" he began, his voice low but laden with fury. "How dare you bring a woman like this into my hotel? Have you completely lost sight of what it means to work here?" Gustavo remained still, sweat beginning to trickle down his neck, but his eyes did not waver. "I brought her in because I thought she deserved a chance," he replied, his voice surprisingly steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "She has talent, Mr. Federico, and I think the people here—" "Talent?" Federico interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Talent isn't what matters here. Do you think this hotel is a stage for rescuing lost souls? For giving charity to the unfortunate?" He moved closer, his face now just inches from Gustavo's. "This place is a temple of excellence, of perfection. Every detail, every person here was chosen because they fit the image I built. And this woman," he gestured disdainfully at Maria, "does not belong in this world." Maria, who had remained silent until then, finally raised her head and looked directly at Federico. Her eyes were calm but steady, and there was something in her stance that exuded a quiet strength. She had faced far greater challenges in life and survived. "Music has no place, sir," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. "It can be born in a palace or on a dirty street corner. What matters is what it carries within." Federico looked at her with disdain, but before he could respond, a new voice was heard. It belonged to one of the guests, a gray-haired man seated near the stage. He, who had remained silent throughout the performance, now stood slowly. "The truth, Federico," he said, his voice deep and composed, "is that this woman, this singer, brought something we all forgot a long time ago." The entire hall turned to the man. He was one of the most influential guests of the night, a businessman known for his wealth and ruthless deals, someone whose opinion carried weight. Federico, surprised by the interruption, shot him a hard look. "And what exactly did she bring, Almeida?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "She brought soul," Almeida replied without hesitation. "Something this party, with all its shine, lacked. She reminded us of what is real." For a moment, Federico looked stunned. The entire room was in absolute silence, and the expressions of the other guests began to change. There were, of course, still some with disdainful expressions, but many were clearly moved by Maria's performance, and Almeida's opinion seemed to crack the social armor everyone wore that night. Gustavo felt a wave of relief mixed with tension. He knew Federico was not the kind of man to back down easily, especially in public. The silence in the hall only increased the pressure in the air, as if everyone were waiting to see Federico's next move. "Soul?" Federico repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "What you call soul, I call disorder. Disrespect. I built this hotel to be a symbol of perfection, of control. Nothing out of place. And now, thanks to this recklessness," he shot a glance at Gustavo, "you're telling me I should allow a beggar to sing here?" Before Almeida could respond, another guest, a middle-aged woman adorned with gleaming jewelry, stood up. "I agree with Mr. Almeida," she said, her words laden with contained emotion. "This woman, she reminded me of things I had long forgotten. Her music touched me." Federico turned to the woman, irritation flashing in his eyes. He was about to argue, but to his surprise, more guests began to stand and voice their support for the unexpected performance. One after another, quiet but firm voices echoed through the hall. "She is something special," said another man. "It was the only part of the night that didn't feel artificial," murmured a young woman, who until then had remained silent with her friends. "She brought something that was missing here." With each new voice, Federico's fury seemed to grow. He looked around, seeing his party, slip out of his control. Gustavo watched, feeling the tension in the air as nearly tangible. It was clear Federico was losing patience, and Gustavo knew this would not end well. With eyes blazing, Federico raised his hand, demanding silence. The room immediately fell quiet, but the atmosphere was unmistakably different now. The guests' expressions were no longer merely admiring. A new energy filled the room, something that challenged the rigid authority with which Federico had always ruled the hotel. He turned to Gustavo, his jaw clenched. "You made a grave mistake, Gustavo, and I assure you, there will be consequences." Despite the fear pulsing in his chest, Gustavo found the strength to stand firm. "I know, sir, but it was the right thing to do." Federico stepped closer to Gustavo, his voice now a cold whisper. "You dare to defy me? In front of everyone?" Before Gustavo could respond, Maria, who had remained silent while the argument flared around her, stepped forward. Her gaze was calm, but carried a quiet determination. "I am nothing more than a voice," she said, her voice reverberating through the hall with impressive calm. "And if you want me to leave, I will. But know this, true beauty cannot be controlled. It appears where it's least expected." Federico remained silent for a moment, his face rigid as he stared at Maria. Their eyes met, and for a second, something in Federico's posture seemed to falter. But without responding, he took a step back, turning abruptly, clearly overtaken by anger. The confrontation wasn't over. Not at that moment, at least, but the battle already felt different. As Federico exited toward the door, the hall remained in tense silence, as if everyone were waiting for the conclusion of the confrontation. The hall remained in stifling tension after Federico's departure, but Maria, still on stage, seemed distant from it all. Her eyes, which had spent most of the evening fixed on the floor or discreetly wandering around the hall, were now resolute. There was something on her face, a mix of resignation and courage, that indicated her time there was nearing its end. But before any action could be taken, Maria took a step forward on the stage, her presence suddenly more commanding than before. The pianist, still dazed, waited for instructions, but Maria simply raised a gentle hand, signaling him to start again. The soft notes filled the air, and the room, previously filled with whispers and tension, fell silent once more. Maria closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed the melody to guide her. Her voice, as it joined the music, carried a profound sadness, a pain that seemed to transcend time and place. She sang as if each word were a memory etched in her heart, a lament for something lost that she could never reclaim. The song was slow, melancholic, but undeniably beautiful. Each note seemed to linger in the air longer than it should, as if suspended between the present and the past, carrying a sense of nostalgia and regret. The hall, now completely silent, absorbed every chord, every nuance of Maria's voice, which seemed to lay bare her soul before everyone present. When the final note finally faded into the air, the silence that followed was even deeper than before. There was no applause, no murmurs, only the sound of absolute silence. It was as if no one there knew how to react to such a raw and honest performance, so different from anything they had ever witnessed in their lives of excess and appearances. Maria remained motionless on stage, her eyes now open and fixed on the floor, as if waiting for reality to reassert itself. Gustavo, watching from his corner, was about to intervene. He knew Federico would return at some point and feared what would happen. His body was tense, and worry clouded his thoughts. But before he could act, Maria took a small step forward and, with a soft, almost whispering voice, began to speak. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "You look at me and see only an old woman, someone who no longer has a place in the world you know. Perhaps you think I'm just one of many who wander lost. And for a long time, maybe I was exactly that." Maria paused, and the silence around her became almost tangible. Every person in the room was entirely focused on her, as if her words held the power to reveal something far greater than the simple story of a homeless woman. "But I wasn't always this way," she continued, her voice now slightly stronger, though still laden with emotion. "There was a time when I belonged to this world, or at least I thought I did." The guests exchanged glances, and Gustavo held his breath, sensing that something profound was about to be revealed. Maria lifted her gaze, and for the first time that night, her eyes met those of everyone around her, one by one. "I was a singer," she revealed, her voice trembling slightly. "A long time ago, my name was known. I sang in theaters, in halls like this one, and for a while, I believed my voice was what defined me, that it was the most precious thing I had. But life has a cruel way of reminding us what truly matters." The emotion in each of Maria's words began to ripple through the room like an invisible current. There was something genuine in her pain, something that transcended appearances and spoke directly to the hearts of those present. "I had a family," she continued, her voice growing softer, almost as if she were struggling to hold back tears. "A husband whom I loved more than anything, and a daughter, my little Sophia." She paused, and everyone could see the glimmer in Maria's eyes, an ancient pain still burning as if time had not passed. "They were my life, my music. I sang for them, to make them happy, so our home would always be filled with joy." Gustavo's eyes widened, and he felt a tightness in his chest. Something in her story, in the way Maria spoke of her daughter, touched him deeply, as if he were hearing echoes of his own mother, who had also sung to fill the void of a difficult life. But then one night, Maria stopped, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath with her. One night, an accident that took them both. My husband, my daughter, both gone at once. A soft murmur ran through the room. Some guests began to lower their eyes, ashamed of their earlier assumptions. Maria continued, her voice now filled with raw but controlled pain. My life, everything I loved, disappeared in an instant. And I was left behind with a voice that meant nothing anymore. Singing no longer brought me joy. It became a constant reminder of what I had lost. She paused again, taking a deep breath as if she needed strength to go on. And so, I began to wander. I went to the streets, sang for those who had also lost something, who knew what pain was. Because, deep down, that's what music does. It connects souls that are wounded, that know what it means to be alone. By now, some guests had tears in their eyes, while others remained motionless, processing what they were hearing. No one dared to speak. Maria's presence had become immense, larger than the room, larger than any party. She was now the heartbeat of that night, the pulse echoing within everyone there. She looked at the floor for a moment, then raised her head with an unexpected strength. I sing to remember them, my husband, my daughter, and to remind myself that I still have a soul, that even lost, I am still someone. And that's the one thing no one can take from me. The hall was in absolute silence. Maria's truth hung in the air, immense and overwhelming. The woman whom everyone had underestimated and ignored had now exposed her soul before them all. The weight of her loss, her pain, was now part of the room's atmosphere. The faces of the guests showed a mix of shame, sadness, and for some, a newfound respect. Gustavo, both anxious and moved, looked at Maria with a mix of admiration and guilt. He had brought this woman into the hotel, but he could never have imagined the depth of her story or the extent of her loss. Now, he understood why he had felt a connection to her from the very beginning. Maria took a small step back, her body slightly hunched from emotional exhaustion, but her eyes remained fixed on the faces around her. She didn't need to say more. Her truth, her music, had spoken for itself. The hall remained enveloped in heavy silence, as if Maria's words, filled with pain and sincerity, had suspended time for a few moments. Many of the guests' breaths were uneven, and some eyes still shone with restrained tears. No one dared to break the moment, where the depth of Maria's loss seemed to echo against the golden walls of the Imperial Hotel. But while the guests were visibly moved, there was one person in the room wrestling with something far deeper and more unsettling. Federico, who had thus far maintained his usual mask of indifference and control, felt an internal tremor he could not ignore. Maria's story, so filled with loss and pain, had struck something within him that he had long tried to keep buried. He tried to disguise it, as he always did whenever any emotion threatened to surface, but he couldn't. His shoulders, always rigid and authoritative, seemed to slump slightly, as if they were carrying an invisible weight. Something in this woman, in her story, had cracked a part of his unyielding exterior. His eyes, which until then had moved with calculated coldness, now fixed on the floor, avoiding Maria's gaze. He felt his stomach churn, his throat tighten. The hall around him, once so familiar and under his absolute control, now seemed to slip away. It was as if Maria's words had transformed the place, pulling him out of his comfort zone and forcing him back to a time he avoided remembering. Gustavo, still watching from his corner, noticed the subtle change in Federico's posture. There was something in the hotel owner's eyes, a reflection of unspoken pain, a dark shadow simmering beneath his rigid exterior. The receptionist held his breath, fearing what might happen next, but unable to look away. Federico was known for being relentless, always in complete control of his emotions. But now there was a crack in his facade. Maria, unaware of the inner turmoil her story had caused, simply waited. Her figure, fragile yet dignified, remained at the center of the makeshift stage, as if she too were trying to process the weight of everything she had just revealed. But while most eyes were on her, the true emotional battle was unfolding within Federico. Federico took a step back, as if he needed space. He struggled to maintain his composure, but with each passing second, he felt more vulnerable. It was as though Maria's words had opened a door he had kept locked for years. A door to memories buried under his ambition, his need for control, his rigidity that allowed no cracks. Yet now, in front of everyone, those memories threatened to overflow. He rubbed his hand over his face, as if exhausted. Something was happening inside him, something he couldn't control. Maria's grief-laden voice resonated within his own memories. Memories of a past he had suppressed so thoroughly that he had nearly erased it. Nearly. Maria's loss, her husband and daughter, prodded an old wound within Federico. His gaze, once cold and calculating, wavered. He felt the air grow heavier, his chest tighten. Suddenly, he was no longer in that hall of luxury and opulence. In his mind, flashes of a lost time returned with force. A laugh, a soft scent, a sunny afternoon in a garden. And then a sudden, crushing darkness. The guests remained frozen, still absorbing Maria's words. Yet, some began to notice Federico's transformation. The man who had always been a rock of determination now seemed to be losing control. Small whispers rippled through the hall as curious eyes turned toward the hotel owner, who now looked deeply vulnerable. Gustavo, standing close, saw something that others missed. A solitary tear slipping down Federico's cheek. It was so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but to Gustavo, that single tear was a shock. Federico, the man who seemed made of iron, was on the verge of breaking. Federico took a few more steps back, as if trying to distance himself from the scene, but his memories pursued him. The hall transformed into a prison of memories he didn't want to relive. He remembered her as wife. That afternoon, the last time he saw her smile before everything changed. The accident had taken his wife and his young daughter. In an instant, he had lost everything. And like Maria, he was consumed by grief. But unlike her, he hadn't sung to keep his soul alive. He had buried his pain deep, building walls around his heart, walls he believed were unbreakable. He had funneled his grief into work, perfectionism, and absolute control. The hotel, his career, his success. All of it was his way of keeping the pain at a distance. The luxury, the coldness, the indifference were his armor. Yet now, Maria's raw suffering, her courage in laying bare her soul, had pierced the defenses he had spent decades building. And for the first time in years, Federico felt exposed. Vulnerable. Maria, in turn, seemed to sense the change in Federico. She didn't know what was happening inside him, but there was something in his expression that was familiar to her. The pain in Federico's eyes wasn't just anger or frustration. It was something much deeper. It was the pain of someone who had also lost. "I sing to remember," Maria had said. And now, Federico understood what that meant. He had spent years trying to forget, but the pain didn't disappear. It only transformed, hardening within him. The suffering he saw in Maria's eyes was a mirror of the grief he had suppressed. Federico turned abruptly, covering his mouth with his hand as if to stifle a cry or sob he refused to release. His rigid posture no longer concealed his internal struggle. He hurried out of the hall, leaving the guests murmuring in surprise, but he said nothing. The only sound was the echo of his footsteps against the marble as he walked away, seeking refuge from his emotions. In the hall, silence reigned once more, but everyone could feel that something profound had occurred. The once imposing and relentless figure of Federico had partially crumbled, and for the first time in many years, he was no longer the man in control of everything. He was simply a wounded man. Maria remained standing on the stage, her eyes now calm. She didn't say anything else, knowing that her music and the truth it carried had already spoken enough. The silence that filled the Imperial Hotel's hall was almost tangible. Federico's abrupt exit had left the guests in a state of confusion and discomfort. It was the first time many had seen the hotel's owner, always so ruthless and authoritative, display any sign of vulnerability. But what none of them knew, except Maria, was that Federico's heart had been profoundly touched. Her story had broken through the barriers he had spent his life constructing, but what was about to unfold would be even more unexpected. Maria, still on the small, improvised stage, watched the door through which Federico had left. Her eyes, serene and full of understanding, reflected a near mystical calm. There was something in her posture, in the way she stood there, suggesting she knew more than she had revealed. And, indeed she did. The guests began to murmur, uncertain about what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Gustavo, as if expecting him to explain what had happened, but he was just as confused. He sensed that there was a deeper connection between Maria and Federico, something that went beyond appearances. Maria took a step forward, breathing deeply as if carefully preparing her words. Then, with a soft and resolute voice, she broke the silence. "I know what he carries in his heart." The murmurs in the hall ceased instantly. Everyone turned to look at Maria, now in complete silence, as if her words held a gravity no one could ignore. Gustavo, stunned, held his breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to be revealed. With a tranquility that seemed almost supernatural, Maria continued, "They're still with him, his wife, his daughter. They never left him, and he has never been able to let them go." Her eyes shone with a strange serenity as she spoke. The hall, filled with people accustomed to luxury and opulence, was now steeped in a mystery none of them fully understood. It was as if the very atmosphere had changed. The air felt denser, more laden with meaning. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, trying to grasp what Maria was saying. Gustavo, however, felt a current of electricity rush through him. He had no idea how Maria could know what she was saying, but the tone of her voice, the certainty in her words, left no doubt that she had touched on something profound and personal, something even he, who had worked with Federico for years, didn't know. Maria took another step forward, as if speaking directly to the door through which Federico had left. "I saw your wife and daughter in my dreams," she continued, her voice soft but full of authority. "They are at peace, but they ask that you find peace too." These words, spoken with an almost divine serenity, froze the room in absolute silence. It was as if everyone there held their breath, trying to process what Maria had just said. Her statement carried a spiritual weight, something that transcended the simple tragedy they had just heard. Maria was not merely speaking to Federico's pain. She was touching on something greater, something none of those present expected. Out in the hallway, Federico had stopped walking. His steps, once hurried and furious, were now suspended. He heard Maria's words as if they were whispered directly into his ear. His hands trembled slightly, and he felt a chill run down his spine. How could she know? How could this woman, a stranger, a beggar, know something he had never confessed to anyone? The image of his wife and daughter flooded his mind, a memory he had fought for years to keep locked away. His daughter's smile, the warmth of family afternoons, the sense of completeness he had felt with them. All of it came rushing back with overwhelming force. a force he was unprepared to face. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to contain the emotions threatening to overflow, but it was futile. In the hall, Maria continued to speak, her voice now softer, as if whispering a universal truth to all present. We carry the pain of loss because we don't want to forget those we love, but what they truly wish is for us to find peace, to live for them, but also for ourselves. Inside Federico, something broke. He tried to maintain control, tried to keep his composure, but Maria's words had cut too deep. He was no longer the rigid, relentless man who dominated every situation. No longer. Now, he was simply a broken man, a man who had avoided confronting the pain of losing those he loved most. His eyes filled with tears, tears he had refused to shed for so many years. One tear escaped, sliding slowly down his time-worn face. He didn't make any effort to stop it, nor did he try to hide it. He felt vulnerable in a way he never had before. His emotional armor, the one he had used to protect himself through years of success and control, was now shattered. Inside the hall, everyone noticed what was happening. Even without seeing Federico directly, they could sense the change. Maria, with an almost ethereal calm, simply nodded slightly, as if knowing that her words had reached Federico at the very moment he needed them most. Federico, still in the hallway, took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy. He couldn't return to the hall just yet. He couldn't face Maria, Gustavo, or the guests. Not while his mind was consumed by a storm of memories and emotions beyond his control. Without a word, Federico turned around and, with heavy, unsteady steps, walked quickly down the corridor, exiting through the side door that led to the garden. The night air was cold, and the chill helped relieve the suffocating heat inside him. He stopped beside a tall tree and finally allowed the tears to flow. He was dazed, completely unguarded. In the hall, the silence continued. Maria, still on the small stage, looked around with an almost maternal serenity. She knew there was nothing more to say. What needed to be said had already been said. Now, all that remained was silence, a silence that carried with it truth, acceptance, and for some, perhaps the beginning of healing. Gustavo, observing everything from his position, felt a lump in his throat. He had never seen Federico so vulnerable, and now, seeing Maria there, so simple yet so powerful, he understood that the night had been much more than a mere breach of hotel protocol. It had been a night of revelations. For Maria, for Federico, for everyone present. What would happen next, he didn't know, but something had changed forever that night. The next morning, the Imperial Hotel seemed cloaked in an unusual silence. The grandeur of the place, normally vibrant and bustling, was now wrapped in a sort of contemplative quiet. The lobby, with its crystal chandeliers and gleaming marble, still shone brightly, but something had shifted since the previous night. Something deeper, invisible yet palpable, as if the hotel itself had borne witness to a silent transformation. Gustavo, however, was far from feeling at peace. He had spent the night awake, fearing what would happen to his job, to his future. Defying Federico was something no one dared consider, and yet Gustavo had publicly and directly challenged the power of the hotel owner. Now, all he could do was await his punishment. Maria had also remained at the hotel, in a simple room Gustavo had offered, so she wouldn't have to return to the streets that night. She was quiet, with an almost supernatural calm, as if she already knew that destiny was unfolding as it should. For Maria, what happened next didn't matter as much. She had fulfilled her purpose. Her music, her story, had reached the heart of someone who needed it most. In the early afternoon, Gustavo was summoned to Federico's office. The walk there seemed longer than ever, and each step he took down the corridor added weight to his shoulders. When he reached the solid wooden door, he hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking. Once called to enter, he opened the door slowly and saw Federico sitting behind his mahogany desk, looking out the window with a distant expression. Federico's office was as imposing as he was. The walls were adorned with expensive art, the shelves filled with finely bound leather books. Yet something in the room felt different that day. There was an unusual calm in the air, a stillness that Gustavo didn't recognize. Federico turned slowly, and his eyes met Gustavo's. The receptionist felt his heart pound in his chest, bracing himself for the reprimand, the seemingly inevitable dismissal. But, to his surprise, Federico's gaze was not one of anger. There was something else there, a vulnerability that Gustavo had never seen in the man before him. "Close the door, Gustavo," said Federico, his voice low, but without the usual hardness. Gustavo did as he was told and remained standing, waiting for the verdict. The silence in the office was almost oppressive, and he felt compelled to break it. "Mr. Federico, I wanted to apologize for last night. I know I disobeyed the rules and—" Federico raised a hand, cutting him off. "No," he said calmly. "That's not why I called you here." There was a pause, and then Federico rose from his chair, walking slowly to the front of the desk. He stopped just a few steps away from Gustavo, his eyes still somber, but now with a different light. The light of someone who had spent the night reflecting on something he could no longer ignore. "Last night, it shook me," Federico admitted, his voice softer than Gustavo had ever heard. "I tried to keep control, as I always do. I tried to resist. But that woman's words, her story, they touched something I never let anyone see." Gustavo stayed silent, his body motionless, while Federico spoke. He realized that this moment wasn't about his punishment. It was about something much bigger, something Federico was finally willing to share. "Many years ago, I also lost everything," Federico continued, his voice becoming heavier. "My wife, my daughter, they died in a car accident, an accident I tried for years to forget. I buried that pain, Gustavo, buried it deep, and in the place of that pain, I built this hotel, this fortress, a barrier between me and anything that could remind me of them." He paused, his eyes briefly turning to the window, where the soft afternoon light streamed in. "I thought that if I controlled everything around me, if I kept the world at a distance, I would never feel that pain again. But last night, Maria, she showed me I was wrong." Gustavo felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined that Federico carried such a heavy burden. The hotel owner's impenetrable mask was finally falling, and the man behind it was someone deeply wounded. "Maria," Federico continued, "with her music, with her story, she brought everything back. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't ignore what I feel." Federico paused for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. I can't go on like this anymore, pretending nothing happened. I realized I need to make peace with my past. And somehow Maria helped me see that." He turned to Gustavo and, for the first time, offered a faint smile, a tired but genuine smile. "You did the right thing last night, Gustavo. I know you thought you were breaking the rules, and in a way you were, but sometimes the rules need to be broken." Gustavo was stunned, unable to respond immediately. He hadn't expected Federico to forgive him, let alone admit that he was right. Relief washed over him, accompanied by a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you, sir," was all he managed to say, his voice low but filled with emotion. Federico nodded and then walked over to the window again, gazing at the horizon as if seeing something far off, perhaps memories, perhaps new possibilities. "I want Maria to stay," he said finally, still looking outside. "I want her to sing in the hotel, officially. Not as a beggar, but as the artist she is." Gustavo could hardly believe what he was hearing. The man who, hours earlier, had been furious over Maria's presence now wanted her to become part of the hotel. It was a transformation he could never have imagined. Federico turned back again, this time with a calmer expression. "I also need you to know, Gustavo, you're no longer at risk. You showed something last night that this hotel needed. You showed humanity. And that's something I had been forgetting." Federico's words lingered in the air, and Gustavo finally felt the weight of fear and uncertainty dissipate. He had risked everything for an act of compassion, and now that same act was bringing change, not only to him, but to Federico as well. "Sometimes," Federico said thoughtfully, "forgiveness comes from where we least expect it. Maybe that's what Maria tried to show me." The silence in the office was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Maria, standing at the entrance, her face serene. She entered slowly, without ceremony, and looked at Federico as if she already knew what he was about to say. Federico looked at her, and for a moment, their eyes met in silent understanding. "Maria," he said, his voice softer than ever, "I'd like to apologize for what happened yesterday. And I'd like to invite you to sing here whenever you want." Maria, with her calm and maternal expression, smiled slightly, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of many lives and many stories. "Sometimes, what the soul needs is a place to be heard," she said, in her usual calm tone. For the first time in years, Federico felt something settle within him, something he had kept locked away for so long. And as he looked at Maria and Gustavo, he knew that his journey of healing was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.